at some of the statistics, and then we'll move on. 69% say increasing pressure on directors translate to more pressure on the CFOs. 92% of respondents say greater concerns around risk management are expected to increase demands in the audit committee in the next 24 months, which will in turn translate into higher pressure for the CFOs. 83% cited greater turmoil in the capital and debt markets as a factor, and other sources of increased demand on ACs leading to more pressure on CFOs. Accounting standard setters at 87%, security regulators 75%. So I don't think there's any huge surprises there. The only one that surprised me was the 31% that don't think increasing pressure on the directors is not going to impact the CFOs. I think they might find that they might be naive there. But actually, let me ask one more question before I jump forward. What is the biggest issue, challenge, or concern you foresee regarding the CFO relationship in your audit committee in the next 12 months? Is there one issue in particular that you think is going to take more airtime and more of time of CFO? Any thoughts on that, Laura?
Nothing. I can't think at this moment of any one issue. Laura, can you help me out here?
Well, I was going to say I think that's going to be company specific in terms of what's going on with the company. If you've got a strategic review underway, rest assured that's going to impact the audit committee. If you've got the audit committee tends to pay more attention, I think, to capital strategy. So if you've got a financing, whether it be on the debt or equity side, I think also. So again, it's going to be company specific as to what's going on in the company. I'm not sure that that there's anything necessarily externally driven that will.
There's nothing like IFRS coming down the pipe. I was at a meeting yesterday from one of the technical committees of FEI, and the OSC was there, and the standard setters from the Accounting Standards Board were there. There's nothing huge. There's just a lot of continual improvement, continual change. And the OSC continues to look for their specific areas of involvement, making sure that there's reasonable compliance. But I don't think there's anything like an IFRS that I know of.
Yeah, I think it's kind of where I make my bread and butter is it is in the standard settings, and I think this we've got a little bit of a breath in the next 12 months. But with what's going to happen with leases, revenue recognition is out there, hedging, financial instruments. So there's some big ones coming down the pipe that have some impact. But no wholesale changes.
They seem to be working now on what they call the Big Four to try and get those. So that's the international board. So they've narrowed the scope, but made it quite a bit deeper. So I agree with you.
Okay. Let's move on to the internal auditor and the CEO and other individuals that play in. We'll leave the external auditor out to the end. Maybe we'll run out of time. I wanted to talk about that. But it was interesting when we had an original discussion on this study that from an internal audit perspective, it was very different, and it was across the board. I'm going to do this by a show of hands as well. Who the internal auditor reported to and who the internal auditor should report to. And I hit a couple of the quotes here. I found as an internal auditor working with the CFO, especially if you have a CFO who wasn't territorial, who wasn't defensive, and was willing to improve areas, it's so much more helpful than working for the CEO, but you do have contact with the CEO. Others found that say, you shouldn't be reporting to management at all. That's a complete conflict. You should be reporting to the audit committee chair. So where does that dotted line, the solid line, lie? So show of hands, how many people have an internal audit function, first of all? Let's see the group. So actually not a huge number. And how many of those report to the CFO? A couple, a few. CEO? Okay. And audit committee chair. Dual reporting, I think there's a couple. So it is mixed. But Lori, what's your experience?
Well, there's the formal and then there's the informal. And I think what Isabel was kind of referring to was a little bit more of the informal as to where that can work. And what I mean by that is that so long as you've got a mature internal auditor that knows that that their duty is to go to whoever they need to go to, and that they're going to be received appropriately, whether that's the CEO or the audit committee chair or the chairman of the board. we had the internal control function, internal auditor function at Marsflex. And the reality of it is that the lion's share of what she did was determined by the CFO, but she also knew that she had an open, my door was open, the audit committee's door was open, she had access to the board and would be comfortable using that. I had no doubts about whether or not she would use that if she needed to. So I think it's no different than the CFO reports to the CEO, but has got responsibilities that if they're in conflict with the CEO, then they've got to raise them with the audit committee and the board. I think so. That's why I say there's the informal and then there's the formal. So long as the board is ensuring that if you've got that role, they've got access to them. And ultimately, I guess that's why most public companies have got hotlines and confidential alert lines where anybody can phone in. And in our case, we had that, and that would go not only to me, but to the audit committee at the audit committee chair at the same time. So ultimately, it can be a role that can be very effective in just improving the operation of the company without having to worry about whether or not there's an independence and an ability to get to the right people.
Mark, anything?
I also had internal audit reporting to me, and when I arrived at the company, really it was an orphan function. No one wanted internal audit to report to them at all, but they were mandated to have an internal audit function by a lot of our contracts. And it was a very, very productive relationship, but the one thing I kind of realized in hindsight is we kind of developed a mono-vision where we worked closely enough together that we didn't possibly have the broad perspective we needed to address everything that we should have. And that's a hindsight thought, which actually only came to me while I was listening to Lori speak. And I would make a couple of changes based on that, but at the same time, the nature of the organization wasn't one which anybody wanted internal audit to exist. Never mind report to them. It was just a contractual obligation.
And someone made the mistake of raising their hands here as the only lone internal auditor in the room, and I'd be remiss if I didn't get your views on the reporting relationship.
I think, in my experience, I think for other members I know who are like on the Institute of Internal Auditors, I think for practical basis what happens is most chief auditors report to the CFO, but would have like a dotted line to the audit committee chair. So because there's just a practical thing that you work with this person every day, you want to be in touch with the business. So I think that just basically is a practical matter that works most effectively to work directly for the CFO and deal with administrative matters, but have a reporting relationship to the audit committee. And again, talked about earlier, it's important that the chief auditor has this private time, with the audit committee afterwards. So if there are any issues that the audit committee chairman can look at the chief auditor in the eyes and say, are there any issues? Do I have to be concerned about? Do you have to raise any things? And so that just ensures that the issues are being dealt with, and dealing with that bigger issue that from the board and from the audit committee perspective, that whatever those changing risks are in the business, that they're comfortable that they're fulfilling their mandate by ensuring that internal audit is able to fulfill its mandate.
And how, we'll talk a little bit about this when we get to the external audit piece next. It can be a difficult relationship in that you can be between the CFO and the audit committee chair, potentially. Do you find that dynamic problematic, or have you seen that to be problematic?
Well, I think it's just as you mentioned earlier, is that again, nobody likes surprises. So the thing is that if there's issues that come up, you need to talk with the CFO, you need to talk to the CEO and understand what the issues are. I mean, you can have a disagreement and say that I'm not comfortable with it, but it's ensure that everybody understands what the issues are. Because again, I remind people that as a chief auditor, my job is not to eliminate risks for the business. My job is to make sure that the audit committee and the board understand what the true risks are. And if the board accepts it, then I've done my job. So they're the ones, understanding what the true risks are and making sure that they're satisfied with it. My job is just to make sure that I communicate them effectively, that they understand what the true risks are. And if that's the case, then I've done my job. And the CEO, CFO, if they're agree with that, then I've fulfilled my mandate.
I do look at the internal audit role a little similar to the external in many ways. It's not just being independent. There's some aspect of being perceived to be independent as well, and independence from a frame of mind. I think if you have that, you can be successful in that role, no matter who you report to. But there is that perceived independence that I think needs to be addressed in most organizations.
I think it just goes back to that point you said earlier, that if you have the proper individual that has the credibility and confidence within the business, so they can deal effectively with the board members, but also with the other members of management, and so that they know that you're there to do the right thing, because you're there really protecting the shareholders and the company.
Thank you. Before I leave this section, we spoke briefly about the CEO relationship with the CFO and the Audit Committee. But do you find the CEO is supportive in that relationship with the Audit Committee Chair? What's your history in terms of that relationship and that dynamic? The CEO steps in, obviously they're in the committee, in the boardroom, and hijack the Audit Committee. But what about that dynamic? Mark, what have your
I've seen it go both ways. I've seen it with the CEO really pushing down to keep things so light and simple that, it's good for him, particularly cost-wise, but not particularly good at measuring and capturing all the different risks that we need to engage ourselves with. And then I've seen CEOs who are thoroughly engaged with it, and they want to build up the right structures. So, it depends on the individual. It depends on the culture of the organization to address these things. And in many cases, it's in this changing environment, the speed of the organization to adapt. Do they even want to change to address these as their relation sees them?
Vic,
my experience, Todd, is limited. I think, however, the ideal world, like so many things, if the CEO does not support this fully, and I don't mean just in a tacit fashion, I mean actually support it, it won't be nearly as successful. The internal auditor is going to have a very difficult time, or the chief auditor is going to have a difficult time if he or she does not have the support of the CEO. I think what should happen is the CEO, the CFO, and the internal auditor sit down at the beginning of the year, and the CEO says, look, you report to me, I don't see any other way to keep it. It's more than optics, it's actual fact, to keep the independence. But at the same time, the CEO will not have time to direct the day-to-day activities. So there's got to be the famous dotted line, but I think the CEO has to be responsible, has to take charge.
I've seen it's an important relationship as well between CFO and CEO, and the study doesn't really go there, just touches upon it, but it's one where many times I find the CEO who's driving some strategy and driving some investments, and when it comes down to the accounting, then sometimes may not be common sense, and end up at a result that the CEO doesn't like. Economically, it might be fine, the accounting might be different, and that rub and pressure that can come on the CFO. So you need a strong CFO in those situations, such situations as well.
Todd?
Yes.
Todd, just listening to what's being said, the elephant in the room here is, from the start till now, we talked about the relationship of people. So, do you feel that the current management rep letter and the current opinion on the financial statements provided by the external auditor is accomplishing the role of reporting on the transparency and the reality of the corporate management regime? In other words, strong audit committee, strong CFO, strong CEO, strong board, strong relationships. Because my experience in audit committees and on boards is the capability, the quality of the people at all levels. And there's strong points and there's weak points. But never in the final opinion, when I say, oh yeah, presents fairly, do I see any comment on any of those relationships. Audit committees run by presidents, boards run by strong individuals.
Dan, I'll let you comment.
Yeah, I take your point. I can't imagine a situation where the auditors have the responsibility to report on that. That, to me, is an abdication of what the board should be doing. And you can have management rep letters and audit opinions and the documentation that goes into these very complex audits, be it U.S. or Canada-wide, Canada side. In the end, the board has to deal with that. Another form, another checklist, another auditor test saying management's strong, the CFO is weak, the CEO interferes. Boy, you're buying a lot of bureaucracy, I think.
Well, I'll certainly comment on that from wearing the auditor hat, and thank goodness we don't have to comment on that and attest to that. I think it'd be difficult for one thing, because what would the benchmark be that you would attest to? So that would have some difficulty. But I do think the auditors play a role in the dynamic in the room. I think when you do see a CFO that is over their head, and you have that relationship with the audit committee chair, you need to speak your mind, and because there is goal controls there. You're all there to look after shareholders who are hired by the shareholders, and we need to speak up when we see a dysfunction happening, whether it be an in-camera session or in the main audit committee, or to the CFO, to the CEO. So I think that is a auditor responsibility, and you need to, again, we're going to go on to the next session right now, external auditor, so that's a good segue into it. But let me just hit these CEOs, then we'll come back to that. The CEO and internal auditor, 80% agree that dual reporting role, CFO to both AC and CEO, so I think we were somewhat consistent in that. 73% agree the CFO is responsible to the CEO first, have head of the audit committee.